I've often referred to what is happening on climate change, the moral dimension of climate change, as something similar to apartheid, something similar to slavery, because it was okay. It was the normal thing at the time, but it's no longer normal because the moral values have changed, and so it's totally banned. Climate change has not reached that stage yet, where we've come to the realization that it's totally immoral and should not continue.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains politics, policy and economics in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and this week we've got something special for you. This year is the Australia Institute's 30th anniversary, and we're bringing some of the world's brightest thinkers to Australia to help us celebrate 30 years as the nation's leading think tank. Right now, we're hosting Anote Tong, the former president of the Republic of Kiribati, a Pacific island. He spent decades advocating for stronger action on climate change, and he's the current chair of the Pacific Elders Voice, an independent group of leaders from the Pacific Island region.
Pacific Island leaders are calling out rich nations for not doing enough to mitigate climate change.
It's no secret that most Pacific Island leaders would like Australia to do more on climate change.
These include a runaway climate crisis.
We have frequency of cyclones, extreme weather events, extreme rainfalls, prolonged droughts.
The storms are bigger, the surges are bigger, our reefs are disappearing, the fish are not there. People cannot survive.
How 2 degrees could mean the end and 1.5 could mean a fighting chance.
Warmer waters have pushed the Great Barrier Reef into yet another period of mass coral bleaching.
Yet for nearly a decade, Australia's government has failed to take climate change seriously.
The fossil fuel lobby has been very tied to Australian governments.
They are approving new coal and gas, and we simply can't allow it to happen.
The Australia Institute has been working with Anote Tong since way back in 2015, when, ahead of the Paris Climate Summit, he wrote to all world leaders asking them to support a global moratorium on new coal mines and coal mine expansions, the first time anything like that had ever been done before. On the sidelines of the Womadelaide Festival, Anote sat down with Stephen Long, a Walkley Award winning journalist and senior fellow and contributing editor at the Australia Institute. Together they talk about the Australian government's disappointing record on climate, the role of China in the region, and the prospects of a Pacific United Nations climate conference hosted in Australia. And just before I leave you, if you enjoy what you hear, Anote Tong will be speaking in Melbourne and Sydney this week, and we still have tickets available if you want to head along. He'll be speaking with the member for Kooyong, Dr Monique Ryan, at Melbourne Town Hall at 6:30 on Wednesday the 13th of March. That's tonight if you're listening on the day we release this. And he'll also be speaking at Vibe Hotel in North Sydney at 6 p.m. on Friday the 15th of March. And that event will be in conversation with the member for North Sydney, Kylie Tink. And you can find more information via the links in the episode description or at australiainstitute.org.au. Hope you enjoy this conversation.
We seem to have made some progress on climate change on the global stage in the sense that there's less outright denialism and a commitment to action, but few people experience the threat in the way that your nation does, an existential threat. Can you tell me how that feels?
Well, let me begin by just maybe going back to your earlier comments. There's no doubt that there is now an acknowledgement of the science, that it is real, that climate change is something that we must deal with into the future. But the question of commitment to dealing with it, I think that remains a question which there is no clear answer. At the moment, I wouldn't quite say that the global community, especially the concerns, the organizations that must act on climate change, have ever really committed to doing anything about it. And I suppose the reason they're not doing that is because they continue to believe that the benefits that they will be deriving from what it is they're doing far outweighs the challenges and the threats that we are facing as countries on the front line of climate change.
Tell me about the challenges and threats that countries like your own, Kiribati, on the front line of climate change face.
Well, let me be very, very frank, because we have seen challenges over the decades. In my lifetime, I've seen things like that happening, but not to the extent that we are witnessing today. There was no science at the time to make that connection between what was happening as a result of human action and what was progressively getting worse as the climate challenge. Let me give you a very personal example. Earlier last year, and during this year as well, during the very high king tides that we seem to experience at the beginning of the year, okay, we were getting waves up to our front door. There was, I recall, a joke once that was said here in Australia about water lapping at your door.
The Immigration Minister, Peter Dutton, has been asked about the comments that he made that so offended some of the Pacific Island leaders, and here he is.
Does he really think we're about to be, have water lapping at your doors?
Well, it's no longer a joke. It's actually happening in my own home.
Waves up to the front door.
The waves coming over the seawall and come lapping at the door. So without the seawall, there would be nothing left. And that is the reality we are living with. It doesn't happen every day, that's a fact, but it happens.
How does it feel to live in a situation where, unless there is change, unless we stop the progress of global warming, your nation will be underwater?
I must also be quite honest in saying that most of our people don't realize the threat that we are facing, because as a culture, as a people, we tend to live on a day-to-day basis. This has been our very existence, subsistence lifestyle. We don't all have fridges, so we get the food for tomorrow, the next day. And so we hardly look too much into the future. But in terms of what we need to understand on what is happening on climate change, it's a very gradual process, very progressive, but very gradual to the point of being unnoticeable. Yet at the same time poses a real danger, because unless you are reading the reports, the science reports that are coming forward, you are very likely to believe that it's part of the normal cycle of events, which it's not, because it is getting more frequent, it is getting more intense, and it promises to get worse according to the science.
2015, you did something that I believe was unprecedented, writing to every leader in the world seeking a moratorium or support for a moratorium on new coal. I'm fascinated to know, what was the response? How many leaders actually responded, and what was the tenor of their responses?
A number of leaders did write back, but also I had a communication from one of the major coal companies saying that I was wasting my time embarking on this campaign, because coal will always continue to be the main source of fuel for the global community.
What company was that?
I'm trying to recall, but I don't want to make a mistake. But I remember being very frustrated and getting angry, and saying I was going to respond. But my advice is no, don't do this.
Well, I think that you have had the last laugh, because it's clear that coal is in decline.
Well, I'm sure it was the right thing at the time when humanity was trying to fight the challenges that it was facing in different parts of the world. But now that we understand and know precisely the kind of damage it's doing, not only to the future of humanity, but especially for those on the very front line of climate change, challenging their very survival.
So I come back to, can you remember any specific responses from world leaders? Anyone come to mind?
I don't recall, but there was a lot of support that came from some of the leaders, and it's quite some time ago, and I don't have it at hand at the moment.
What about Australia?
I don't recall any response from Australia at that time.
You've had some dealings with Australian leaders over the years, some of them quite pointed.
No, I don't want to be quoting about, because I went through 5 of your prime ministers during my 13 years in office, and but I think something about Australia and the leadership in Australia on climate change is very disappointing in the fact that with the change of government, change of administration, there's always been a change of policy on climate change. Climate change is not a political football. It is a matter of the planetary survival. And I think we need to understand that here in Australia. in the whole of the global community. We need to understand that. It's not just a threat for people in my situation, but for the global community as a whole.
Indeed, we've seen it in Australia with bushfires and floods and an increasingly hostile environment even here. We didn't get much action under the coalition, it's clear. 2022, a change of government, a Labor government, different rhetoric about climate change action, different rhetoric about the Pacific, our friends and partners in the Pacific.
And when we met at the Pacific Island Forum, our change position was included in the communique and it was very much welcomed.
Do what we said we'd do, which is to put more energy and more resources into the Pacific and to be very clear about our level of ambition on climate.
We know because of climate change, we're getting more weather events and they're more intense. So we need to respond as governments, not as political parties. We need to respond as governments.
How does the rhetoric stack up with the reality?
Well, it's been very disappointing, I must say. I did visit with a member of as the Pacific Elders Voice, with also the former president of Palau, to try to link up with the new government at the close of 2022. While we believe they were still in the process of putting together their policy on climate change, we thought our presence in just telling our story, which might contribute to that policy formulation. But unfortunately, it didn't. We didn't get quite the kind of response that we had anticipated. Of course, the current government, while in opposition, was very vocal about climate change. I tend to get the feeling today that they've backed off a little bit. I don't understand why, and I think we need to continue to talk about where the new government in Australia is heading in terms of climate change.
What did they say to you back in 2022?
Well, there was a clear commitment, and I think we appreciated that they were committed to a zero emission level by 2050. And of course, yes, we appreciate that, but it's not about that. It's about your extremely high volume of fossil fuel exports, which is contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions at the global level, no matter who emits it. You are contributing to it. You are benefiting by it. Therefore, you cannot deny responsibility for it.
The third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, that's Australia. I just wanted to run through some stats as I reach over here. Since being elected, the Albanese Labor government has approved 4 new coal projects, the drilling of 116 gas wells, facilitated development of one of the world's largest untapped gas reserves, provided a $1.5 billion subsidy to support gas export infrastructure in the Northern Territory, and all up 44 new coal and gas projects on its major project list, more than $11 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, and I think $700 million from memory to the Pacific to help it adapt to climate change. That's a pretty scary list. How does it make you feel?
Well, I must admit that I find it extremely disappointing. Maybe it was the high expectations on my part of what Australia as a new government would do in response to the climate challenge. But it's what is happening is, I think in some ways, it's a contradiction from what has been said in the past and what is happening. I kept asking the question, why is this happening? Because I cannot understand, because I always had the understanding that the Labor government, the incoming government, would do a lot more in terms of effective climate action. But what is happening on the new initiatives on new fossil fuel mines being opened, that doesn't seem to fit with what was being said before the elections.
When you heard Australia's Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, at the last Global Climate Change Summit say he backed a phase out of fossil fuels, how did you feel?
Well, I'm not surprised in a sense what he's saying, because I had the same response when I had an interaction with him. I think whether he's genuinely committed to that is the question. Because he said, yes, Australia is transitioning out of fossil fuel industry. I did ask the question, so do you have a roadmap for doing that? And the answer was that we are moving into hydrogen and all of these alternative energy sources. But what is happening in the opening of new coal mines is in direct contradiction to that statement and that commitment. So it would suggest that it's not entirely true, whether it reflects a lack of cohesion within government, where one minister might be saying one thing and government is doing something different. It doesn't seem to make sense to me.
When people in the Pacific, when leaders in the Pacific hear the gap between this rhetoric and Australia's action when it comes to exports of fossil fuels and exports of effectively climate change pollution, how do they feel? And what does it do to the relationship between Australia and those nations?
Well, let me tell you how I feel about something like that. Well, it clearly indicates that Australia is really looking out for its own interest. But maybe I should qualify that. Quite often, it's not Australia as a people, as a country, but it's the politicians, the leaders at the time, okay? I can understand it being politically expedient in order to maintain the economic numbers up so that you might get re-elected, okay? But the challenge is, what does it mean in the longer term? Does it benefit the Australians? Certainly not our people. And so we ask the question, you're part of our family, yet at the same time you are contributing to what it is discussing, the greatest challenge that we are facing. And so how can we match this? What you're saying and what you're doing, they don't seem to match.
This has potentially got fascinating geopolitical implications. We recently saw in Australia a lot of concern about the Solomons moving closer to China, entering perhaps a security pact, although it's not entirely clear, with the Solomons. What impact does Australia's stance on fossil fuels have in terms of those relationships and those geopolitical relationships in the Pacific?
I think what is definitely true is that how we interact with each other, Australia and the Pacific, on an issue of extreme importance to the region in terms of climate change will define the relationship that we have forward. And so far, that has not been so promising. And so initiatives by new entrants into the geopolitical landscape in the region are going to find it advantageous to make use of this.
In short, this could drive more Pacific countries into a closer relationship with China at Australia's expense?
Well, it would provide an excuse of some countries to do that. And I think, quite frankly, it's something that I've watched over the years. I've had my ups and downs. There were times when I was in office when I thought that Australia was being unduly unreasonable on some issues. And there were times when we have extremely good relations. But of course, this is what happens in any relationship. But I think there's got to be that entrenched goodwill that must exist, because if that does not exist, then any slight provocation, any departure from the norm would provide a good excuse to do what it is that perhaps another interest is trying to provoke you to do. And I think this is possibly what's happened with the Solomon Islands and China, and of course with Kiribati as well. We just recently reestablished relations with China.
Do you think that Australia is underestimating that threat?
I think Australia has become complacent over the years, over the decades really, because we've always been there. We've always been looking south. I talk from experience, because we didn't believe that we had any relationship with the other side of the world. Our vision has always been south-directed, and that is a legacy of our colonial past. But over time, we've interacted at the United Nations, at other international fora, and began to understand that there are other countries out there. And let me share this one, because I don't think it's ever been said. When Fiji was suspended from the forum in 2012, I believe, Fiji began to look around for a relationship with other countries. And we saw that. Definitely, I saw that. And I began to understand that there are other countries out there who had an interest in the Pacific. And so we need to, from whom we could benefit in our relationship. And so we began to do that.
So that's the Pacific Islands Forum?
At the Pacific Islands Forum, yes. And so I think in Fiji beginning to establish relations with the Middle Eastern countries and what have you, I think we began to realize that Australia and New Zealand and the United States were not our only partners. We did have potential partners out there.
Australia will seek to co-host the bid with the Pacific to help elevate the case for the region and need for more climate action.
Every single one of the island nations' support for our bid for a conference of the parties on climate change to be held with Australia and the Pacific.
Australia is now proposing it lead a coming global summit on climate change, COP31, and billing this as the Pacific Climate Summit that it will do in partnership with Pacific nations. How do you feel about that, given Australia's position as a fossil fuel exporter?
Well, let me say that initially I applauded the move. I think I'd always been argued that Australia could and should take leadership on climate change, and because particularly in terms of its very strong or professed very strong relations with the Pacific Island countries. And knowing that this is a critical issue for the Pacific Island countries, we had always expected that Australia would join us and be the leader, assist us, because we don't have the critical mass, we don't have the influence to shape world affairs. And Australia being a part of that would have been a wonderful way to spearhead a Pacific initiative, Australia being a part of it, on an issue like climate change.
I hear a but coming.
But of course they did not do this. Unfortunately, Australia has not been consistent in doing this. There were times, I recall, in 2009, I remember Kevin Rudd in the Copenhagen discussions lobbying around for support for action on climate change. Of course, that changed again with the change of government. And that's been disappointing. So in Australia, trying to be a leader, to be host for the upcoming COP, and to rope in the Pacific Island countries, unless Australia is willing and prepared to make some very, very clear commitments to climate action, it's going to be a contradiction. I am sure that the Pacific Island countries will be able to see through this. How they deal with it is going to be a question. I don't have the answer for that, but I know what I would ask of Australia if it wants us to be a part of that initiative.
What would you ask?
Well, I would ask that all the things that we've been asking, not unreasonably, because asking for your survival is not unreasonable. And we would ask again for much more concrete action on the fossil fuel industry.
Tell me about the Port Vila Declaration. Well,
that is an interesting one. I think it's a reassertment of our commitment we made in Suva in 2015 prior to the Paris discussion. And that is a total move away from the fossil fuel industry as a source of energy.
So no new coal and gas?
Well, it's essentially saying the call that I made in 2012 for a moratorium on coal. I think the Vanuatu Declaration is saying a moratorium on the opening of new sources of fossil fuel.
Including gas?
Including gas.
So Australia seems very locked into gas exports because it's somewhat beholden not only to fossil fuel companies but Japan. It's getting enormous pressure from Japan, and the argument that's put is that gas is a transition fuel. What do you reckon?
Well, I'm not the scientist, but any movement I think is welcome, but I think there has got to be a commitment to a total transition at some point, because the reality and the science is very clear that unless we do this, countries like mine will definitely be underwater or whatever. The future is definitely won't be what we believe we won't exist into the future. But I think what is more important is that it threatens the very future of the planet, humanity on the planet. And this includes Australians. It includes everybody on this planet.
Well, in Australia, the proposal is that we can offset the fossil fuel emissions with carbon credits, including from the Pacific. We can buy carbon credits from the Pacific, save your forests, provide income to people in developing nations, and that'll be a win-win.
Well, definitely my understanding, because this is an issue that I've asked questions about, and my understanding is it hasn't worked. It's been abused, and really it has not worked. But I think in all of the discussions for suggesting alternate solutions to that, I've always believed there were distractions, okay? And I understand that some of this is actually part of the formulations that maybe the fossil fuel industries are part of, trying to distract attention away from a total weaning away from fossil fuel dependence.
So that's the way you see the push for Indo-Pacific carbon credits. It's a distraction from the need to actually end fossil fuels and stop opening up new coal and gas projects.
I think we must never understand the power of the fossil fuel industry. At the time that I started off the campaign in 2003-04, the science on climate change was still in the process of consolidation. But once it became solid, the fossil fuel industry could no longer debate the science. What they did was disappear, and I said, wonderful. But I think the biggest mistake I made was to believe that the fossil fuel industry would disappear. They did disappear, but went underground and began, I believe, now lobbying governments and possibly controlling governments, and which is even more dangerous. And I think this is where we must be a lot more vigilant, because it's not that the fossil fuel industry has not gone away.
And you see the carbon credits push in those terms as essentially like the tobacco industry finding a backdoor way to keep going.
Yeah, it's like saying, let's damage it, but with our technology, we will fix it. No, that's not the way it ought to happen. Let's stop damaging it.
Like carbon capture and storage.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm involved with the Climate Overshoot Commission, and we've been pressing, don't depend on the solar radiation management modification. Because, again, that is another distraction. It gives us the excuse, and it gives the fossil fuel industry the excuse to keep carrying on with business as usual.
Australia raises what's known as the drug dealer's defence. If we don't dig up the coal, if we don't bring the gas onto market, someone else will.
I've heard that argument before when I was trying to lobby the European Union to take leadership on climate change. They said, we cannot do it with the United States. And I said, no, you can do it. Take leadership for a change. Lead the United States on this. You know, somebody has got to make that breakthrough to say that this is the right thing, let's do it. Rather than wait for everybody else to believe that, okay, let's agree on doing the right thing.
In moral terms, it's always struck me as being akin to saying it's okay if I, go to the toilet in the river because everyone else is.
Well, that's exactly what it is. I mean, I've often referred to what is happening on climate change, the moral dimension of climate change, as something similar to apartheid, something similar to slavery, because it was okay. It was the normal thing at the time, but it's no longer normal because the moral values have changed, and so it's totally banned. Climate change has not reached that stage yet, where we've come to the realization that it's totally immoral and should not continue.
That's an interesting analogy. You see it akin to apartheid, akin to slavery, that it's essentially oppressing people in nations like your own where people have less power.
Absolutely, because it benefits some, but it's so damaging to the rest.
Do you ever despair?
Quite often, I lose sight. I get so depressed, so I switch off once in a while. So I go fishing, so I can re-energize and get re-inspired. But it's a battle that we cannot ever afford to give up on.
Indeed. I think that's absolutely true, and that's probably a good point to finish on. That we need to battle on and change this.
I don't think we have a choice, because the alternative is not acceptable.
Especially for countries like your own.
Absolutely. I'm very happy that my wife was with me, because she's always encouraged me, saying, because I lose heart. And she said, no, you cannot stop doing this, because we've got about 30 grandchildren, and it is their future, as well as everybody else's grandchild. Their future is in our hands, and we must make that decision.
That's where we'll leave the discussion with Anote Tong and Stephen Long. And just a reminder, you can get along to see Anote in conversation in Melbourne and Sydney this week. He'll be in Melbourne on Wednesday the 13th of March and in Sydney on Friday the 15th of March. And you can register for those events via the links in the episode description. This episode was recorded on Saturday the 9th of March 2024, and things may have changed since recording. In 2024, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary as Australia's leading think tank. If you enjoy Follow the Money and the Australia Institute's research, please consider becoming a regular giver from as little as $10 a month at australiainstitute.org.au. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts with an S, podcasts at australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. Our producer is Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.